happen. And the reason why it's not good to be alone with it and kind of perseverate on it by oneself is that we're probably not looking at the right insult. So in our experience, usually PTSD doesn't result from that one traumatic event. We all carry a backpack, and we can all carry all the stressors that have come our way, like we were saying before. But if you're 5, 6, 7 years old and that backpack gets really heavy, you can fall backwards. And when you fall backwards, that's because you don't have the tools really to carry that. But what I'm saying is that it is the accumulation of stressors, some of which may be traumatic, that cause the symptoms of PTSD. So for example, some of us went to Haiti after an earthquake, right? And I was starting my program at that time. I was very young, all ready to talk about earthquakes and know everything about earthquakes. It was the last thing they wanted to talk about. They saw the earthquake as an opportunity to talk about the violence they had been experiencing, the poverty, the lack of education. So they were talking to me about everything they were carrying that led some of them to develop symptoms of PTSD.
I see. As you describe these other aspects of one's life that can have negative impact, poverty, violence, etc., I get the impression that PTSD can be caused by a single event or trauma, but that there's a cumulative aspect to it. So is it the case that in children, because their brain is far more plastic, we know this, brain circuits are modified even by passive experience in childhood, whereas in adulthood it requires focused attention in order to learn, unless it's a negative event, for better or worse. That in kids it takes far fewer or less intense negative experiences in order to create PTSD because the brain is so plastic? Or is there a similarity between youth and adult PTSD?
Epidemiological studies confirm what your assertion. Children, we usually, one line that I really don't like is children are resilient because children are really not. They're more vulnerable. They have the opportunity to become resilient if we help them and we tell them what tools to use and how to develop and all of that. But they are more vulnerable to PTSD. And part of it might be that neuroplasticity. And this is why we care for them, right? This is why we protect them and give them safety, because they are vulnerable. By the same token, that neuroplasticity can work both ways. Because if PTSD is teaching us that the environment can have an impact on biology, that's the only lesson. Right? Environment can have an impact on biology. In PTSD is a negative impact because of a negative stressor or accumulation of stressors. But that also means that if the impact is positive, as in a good supportive system or as in psychotherapy, that recovery can actually happen in an easier way.
Before we talk about therapeutic interventions, I'm curious about genetic predisposition. And a topic that comes up a lot anytime the letters PTSD are stated in that order is transgenerational trauma. I can imagine at least two forms of transgenerational trauma. One is a generation of what are now grandparents or great-grandparents or parents are impacted by some trauma, either in the family or maybe in culture or even broader scale. And then discussions about that pass through generations, impact the children and therefore their adult life. I could also imagine, and I think this is normally what people are referring to when they talk about transgenerational trauma, this idea that somehow the genome is modified by the trauma such that even if kids are raised by parents that adopted them or they have no contact with the grandparents or great-grandparents that experienced the trauma, that somehow they are more vulnerable to, or in some cases, the idea has been put forward, carry that trauma, put in air quotes, such that their life is more difficult, even though they never had a direct experience of that trauma. What are your thoughts about transgenerational passage of trauma, both forms, both the narrative passage as well as the potential for epigenomic or genomic passage of transgenerational
No, this
trauma.
is a very interesting subject. The jury is still out if genomic changes that result as a consequence of stress can be passed from one generation to the other. But certainly the genes that made one generation vulnerable are being passed to the next generation as well. That we know. So it can be passed that way. But what happens is that there's also this impact of learning. And I have treated kids that come to me with all of the symptoms of PTSD, and there's no trauma. I cannot find the trauma, and the parent cannot find the trauma, and the kid doesn't report a trauma. But when I'm talking with the parent, the trauma becomes evident in the history of the parent. So the parent has developed PTSD and behaves in a way that has been learned by the new generation, ways like avoidance or re-experience or hypervigilance or lack of trust, things like that. So certainly there are pathways in which it can go from one generation to the other. And we know that the battle between nature and nurture is pretty much over, right? We know that they both influence vulnerability and that they both interact. And I imagine that's what's happening in some of these situations.
In terms of stress, I always think of stress as both a response within the brain and a response within the body. And I'm not alone in that belief, I think. We know that adrenaline, epinephrine, is released from the adrenals, but also from areas of the brain like locus coeruleus, so that there's this parallel effect of elevated states of mind, more alert, more focused on narrow locations in space and time, and the body is also prepared for action. I think this is what underlies the increased heart rate, the shaking in some cases, sweating. It's essentially a preparation for action. With PTSD, I often hear that some of the symptoms are more of the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of autonomic arousal, right? Things like dissociation, fatigue, kind of checking out, which I realize is dissociation, but things that are more akin to kind of parasympathetic, right? For those that don't know, the sympathetic parasympathetic represents the continuum of autonomic interaction. Sympathetic having nothing to do with emotional sympathy. It's all about fight or flight type responses, although at lower levels, it's what's responsible for us being alert here, but not in fight or flight. And parasympathetic being more of the rest and digest, even leading into sleep type responses. So, if somebody experiences a big stressor, a trauma, or chronic stress to the point where it becomes PTSD, is there a tendency for them to be more hypervigilant and have a startle response, to have their head on a swivel all the time looking for danger, or to be more dissociative, or can both sets of phenotypes exist in the same person?
Yeah. No, this is very interesting. While we're talking about the letters, let me say that a lot of people call post-traumatic stress disorder post-traumatic stress injury, not considering it a disorder, but considering it something that where our fight or flight mechanism, the autonomic nervous system, has been desensitized, and we need to regulate it again. And it's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. It's just like when you break your arm and go to the emergency room and it hurts to be placed back in place, but it's the cure, is what cures it. So a lot of people visualize, and sometimes I do, as an injury rather than a disorder.
Post-traumatic stress injury.
Injury.
Interesting.
And so what happens? So this autonomic system gets activated. We have our fight or flight reaction. But what happens to a young kid? Because they're very little and they cannot fight. They're also very dependent and they cannot flight. So they're stuck. They're stuck there. So they freeze. They freeze, and that's dissociation. It's actually during development a healthy defense mechanism. But very much like a white blood cell, that's very helpful. If you have too much of it, you develop a leukemia. you can develop dissociative disorders if that's the only thing you have. But it does help children cope with some of these situations, pretending this is not real or this is not happening to me. It's the only thing they have left. And because this arousal system is so key in the development of these children, I thought that we should look at the hormone cortisol in the kids. And when I started, when I was a fellow doing my child psychiatry fellowship, I was seeing all types of kids with all kinds of issues. Some had ADHD, some had OCD, some had PTSD symptoms. But I was getting a lot of kids with notes from school saying, this kid has ADHD, please place on Ritalin, right? A stimulant medication. And I'm like, wow, the diagnosis has been made. There's already a treatment plan. What am I training here for? But in some instances, they were right. The kids had ADHD. But in most cases, what happened is that hypervigilance that you're talking about was being misinterpreted as hyperactivity. And the dissociation was being misinterpreted as inattentiveness. So the kids were getting a diagnosis that was not correct. Of course, there are other very complex cases where you have both ADHD and PTSD. Also, ADHD can put you at risk to develop PTSD because you're not as attentive as to what's happening in your environment. But there's definitely two different conditions. And it was that clinical observation that made me think, well, people don't know enough about PTSD, and certainly they don't know enough about PTSD in children. And we were having some research in adults around that time in terms of cortisol levels. David Spiegel, who you've had here, Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA, looking at PTSD in adults. But I said, how does PTSD look early on? What's happening in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that is responsible for secreting cortisol and regulate cortisol when these children are young? Because this is a new axis, is it already not working or is it working right? And so we did a number of studies that demonstrated that the normal circadian rhythmicity of cortisol was there. It was higher early in the morning, which we need to jump out of bed, and as the day progresses, it decreases. Very helpful. It goes up when we are stressed, like when we have lunch. After we have lunch, cortisol goes up, right, so that we can help manage the insult of digestion or whatever. And these kids were having those levels, but something was happening in a number of studies, and we noted that the pre-bedtime level was higher. We were measuring it at different times, in the morning, pre-breakfast, pre-lunch, pre-dinner, pre-bedtime.